Good afternoon, everyone. You're very welcome to join us for this year's annual Irish Studies International Lecture. My name is Peter Gray. I'm the Director of the Institute of Irish Studies, and it's my great pleasure to welcome all of you here on behalf of the Institute, of the School of History, Anthropology, Politics and Philosophy, and also Queen's University. The Institute of Irish Studies was founded in 1965 under the leadership of the eminent geographer Emma Eston Evans, was first Professor of Geography in Queen's University, but a man of tremendous interdisciplinary interests and enthusiasms, who set up the Institute very much as an interdisciplinary gateway for research into the island of Ireland's histories, cultures and societies. And for more than half a century, we have been seeking to serve that mission through such activities as our regular seminar series, supporting conferences and public research events, including one on 1969 in 50th anniversary retrospective, which will be next Friday and Saturday, and also through our Masters and Summer School Irish Studies programmes. But the highlight of our academic year is the International Irish Studies Lecture, to which we welcome scholars and students from across the university as well as members of the public. Previous lecturers have included distinguished international scholars such as Professor David Lloyd from the University of California, Professor Richard Carney of Boston College, Professor Joe Lee of New York University, Professor Elizabeth Malcolm of the University of Melbourne, and Professor Marianne Elliott of the University of Liverpool. So it's with great pleasure then that I introduce the speaker for our 29 Irish Studies International Lecture. Professor Patricia Palmer is professor in the Department of English at Maynooth University. She holds an MA from University College Cork and a DPhil in English Literature from the University of Oxford. She was senior lecturer in the University of York from 2000 to 2008 and reader in King's College London from 2008 to 16 before taking up her current position as Chair of Renaissance Literature at Maynooth in 2017. She works on cultures of early modern Ireland, on the conflictual exchange between English colonists and the Gaelic world, on linguistic colonisation, the aesthetics of violence and the politics of translation. There's also a strong comparative element to her work. She's written on translations of Ariosto, Ursula and Virgil, and on bardic poetry. She's the author, amongst many other publications, of monographs entitled Language and Conquest in Early Modern Ireland, English Renaissance Literature and Elizabethan Imperial Expansion, with Cambridge in 2001, and The Severed Head and the Grafted Tongue, Translating Violence in Early Modern Ireland, published by Cambridge in 2014, and a co-edited volume entitled Early Modern Criticism in a Time of Crisis is due to be published this summer. She's currently working on a book project studying the polyphonic and intersecting literary cultures of early modern Ireland, with the title Darkness Echoing, or Did Ireland Have a Renaissance? And in collaboration with Professor David Baker of UNC Chapel Hill and Professor Willie Maley of the University of Glasgow, she is developing a major digital humanities project, MacMorris, which seeks to map the full range of cultural activity across languages and ethnic groups in early modern Ireland, and which will be supported by an award from the IRC Advanced Laureate Programme. So it's a great honour to welcome Professor Palmer to Queen's University this evening, and I now invite her to give this year's Irish Studies International Lecture on the title, Did Ireland Have a Renaissance?
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Peter, for the invitation. And I'm always grateful for an invitation to Irish Studies things in general, because the early modern often gets dropped from the agenda of Irish Studies. So I really appreciate this signal that this invitation gives about including the early modern in Irish Studies, which, as I say, is often seen as modern rather than early modern, post-language shift, and then kind of Anglo-spherical in some kind of way. So much of what I'm talking about today then is a kind of plea for the insertion of the early modern into the present, into Irish studies. So given the usual post-19th century focus of Irish studies, I come to this lecture as a time traveller. My work rarely makes it out of the 16th century, which is, of course, the distant past, the temporality of what is ostensibly over and out, done and dusted. But for me, the fascination of the past is precisely that it isn't over, that it both shapes and shadows our present, and that we interpret and rewrite it in the light of our own times. I wrote Language and Conquest in Early Modern Ireland in Oxford as the Troubles were stuttering towards an end, and talks about talks and forms of words, what came to be known as Hume speak. Remember, the three strands, the Irish dimension, and agreed Ireland, showed just how central language, including failures of language and incomprehension, continued to be to a conflict which had its origins, after all, in the wars and plantations of early modern Ireland. There were days in the Bodleian Library when I scarcely knew whether I was reading the newspapers or the state papers. Hugh O'Neill disputing definitions. His soldiers, for example, weren't rebels, but men in action. Hugh O'Neill insisting that the Earl of Essex negotiate with him on Saddleback in the middle of the Blackwater River didn't seem a million miles away from parallel talks and the nervous choreography of Gerry Adams' first handshakes. One only had to hear a Secretary of State for Northern Ireland, Peter Brooks, say, or Paddy Mayhew, and it was delicious going back over them during the week to see what exactly they used to say, making yet another gaffe, to be reminded of Garrett Oge, 9th Earl of Kildare. Hauled before the English Council for his stewardship of Ireland, he berated Wolsey and company for their ignorance of Irish realities. You hear, he said, you hear of a case as if it were in a dream, and feel not the smart that vexeth us. It was alive reading it then in the early 90s. It is kind of backstoply live now. The past is never dead, William Faulkner says in Requiem for a Nun. It's not even past. When around 2006 I began to write about violence in 16th century Ireland, I was keenly aware that unforgotten atrocities, betrayals and triumphs from centuries ago continued to leach into the present. But when I started, I never imagined that the seemingly archaic violence of beheading, about which I was writing, had not, after all, been consigned to history, but would, before I finished writing, be stalking our present from Raqqa to the streets of London, where I then lived. So those of us who work on the past work in a double time frame. We live in an urgent present, and we work on a past which has shaped that present. Not only that, our study of the past shows us how the present could have turned out so very differently. The present, which now seems so inevitable, was once an open-ended muddle of paths not taken and outcomes that turned on a sixpence. Imagine if O'Neill had held his nerve on that hill above Kinsale, for example. But while the fixed events of the past can't be changed, the way we write about the past does change. When we include previously neglected voices, look in new places and in new ways, everything can suddenly seem quite different. And in revealing just how complex and plural the past was, we also reconfigured the possibilities of the present. For underpinning that echoing cry of our troubled times, another world is possible, is its enabling corollary, the realization that another world was once possible, that things weren't providentially destined to turn out the way they did, and that therefore the present too can be altered. Far from confirming that there is no alternative, the past shows just how numerous the alternatives were. So many points when radically different futures were in play. When we enlarge our understanding of the past, we expand the possibilities of the present. The title of today's lecture riffs off Joan Kelly's 1977 article, and it was sad revisiting that and looking up Kelly recently and realizing that she was dead before she was 50. But her article, Did Women Have a Renaissance?, a key text in the women's history movement that challenged the marginalisation of women in traditional history writing. Black history, queer history, disability studies, animal studies have all emerged by asking similar questions. Moreover, the recovery of those hitherto invisible histories of women, the colonised, the enslaved, went hand in glove with the women's movement, civil rights, gay liberation, etc., reminding us how closely the past intervenes in and helps to reshape our present. Yet, there are lots of stories that are still untold, and the story of just how complex, culturally rich and diverse early modern Ireland was is one of them. So this evening I want to spend a little time reflecting on the strangely distorted picture we have of that Ireland before exploring how we might expand and thereby transform our understanding of what was, after all, a defining moment in Irish history. First, let's have a look at the problem. In my field, but also because of what is really a problematic hegemony of English, well beyond that field, early modern Ireland is viewed almost exclusively through the accounts of the colonists. I'll let this propagandistic image from John Derrick's An Image of Ireland stand in for countless other works intent on portraying the Irish as primitives badly in need of conquest and reform. And I'll let you to work on your definition of bragatóir. Given that they are texts of conquest, it's not surprising that 16th century English writers misrepresent the country which they too, at one and the same time, deplored and desperately desired to get their hands on. What is surprising and disappointing, however, is that scholars of the English Renaissance focus almost entirely on these works still. This means that most scholars and almost all undergraduates come to early modern Ireland through an extremely narrow canon that doesn't really go much beyond Shakespeare's Henry V, Spenser's Faerie Queene, and his view of the present state of Ireland. The problem is that these texts can give scholars the damaging illusion that they are gaining access to early modern Ireland rather than just an English mindset. Ireland's importance, Christopher Hyley argues in his Shakespeare, Spenser and the Crisis in Ireland, lies in what he calls its centrality to imaginative formations of Englishness. Unsurprisingly, Hyley goes on to specify in a footnote that Gaelic writers, I quote him, remain outside the discourse of Ireland as I define it, unquote. Viewing Ireland through an exclusively English lens leads to a certain kind of confident cluelessness, as when the distinguished scholar Stephen Greenblatt suggests that Shakespeare's Henry V, I quote him, symbolically tames the last wild areas in the British Isles, the doomed outposts of a vanishing tribalism, unquote. It's worth saying in passing that this binary, Ireland as tribal outpost, England as exemplar of Renaissance civility, distorts our understanding not only of Ireland, but of the Renaissance more generally. It feeds into a strand of English Renaissance scholarship that can be still quite hard to detach from proprietary notions of English greatness and national destiny. The quote from in the collection that Peter mentioned, there's a really fascinating article on the uses that Leave.uk made of Shakespeare, for example, in the Leave campaign. The Riddle of Genius, Boris Johnson's Shakespeare, is apparently coming out in July, but I suspect it might be held up by court proceedings, if nothing else. So there is this problem about the Renaissance. It's a bit like poetry of the First World War. It's one of those magnets for a certain kind of interpretation of Englishness. For if the Renaissance means Vitruvian Man, Brunelleschi's Dome and Petrarchan sonnets, it also means freebooter capitalism, religious wars and lots of gunpowder. This too is the face of the Renaissance, and these are some of its Irish faces. But my main focus is not on redefining the English Renaissance, but on helping to move early modern Ireland out from under its shadow, to place it for a change at the centre of its own story. To do so, I'm in the process of launching a project funded by the Irish Research Council, the MacMorris Project. MacMorris, and you can see the acronym is kind of work in progress. The moment I think this is what it is: modelling research in Renaissance mapping actors and communities. Yes, there are too many S's and one C that isn't there at all. But anyway, you get the idea. Its intention is to map every cultural actor for whom a record survives operating in Ireland across languages and communities from 1541 to 1691. By doing so, it aims to redefine our understanding of early modern Ireland, its place in the European Renaissance, and in the wider global networks of an emerging modernity. MacMorris aims to put early modern Ireland quite literally on the map. And so let's start with 3 maps of Munster. And sorry, this is going to be a bit like, did Munster have a Renaissance? Because that's where the kind of key study of this project is going to be. While the database will cover the whole island, then there's a particular project associated with Munster, simply because of the amount that was going on there from so many different cultures, because of the plantation particularly. So our first map of Munster, this is a close-up obviously, is from the Desmond Wars, is from 1572, a single draft of Munster, possibly by Queen Elizabeth's map maker, Leith. It's less a map, though, when you look at it, than a roll call of names spatially organised. There are actually very few geographical details in it, and the names that overwrite the landscape are those of its Gaelic and Gaelicised lords. So it's a map of people. The reproduction is not great, but it just has every single lord, minor and major, Old English and Gaelic Irish, insofar as those names, those definitions make much sense in Munster by the late 16th century. Our next map moves things on, startlingly, I think. It's from 1586, and all those names are gone. This is Munster redrawn as a blank slate. Those curving red lines are those of Elizabeth I's right-hand man, Lord Burghley, and he's divvying up on this blank map the amounts that are to be allocated, the lands that are to be allocated to the New English planters in the plantation of Munster. And have a look at those strangely Ottoman and definitely Islamic buildings. And then our third map fills in the blanks that Burghley's map had shown us. And it fills it in with the names of the New English planters. If we zoom in right on the centre of it, we have Spencer's Castle at Kilcolman, which is the sinecure for the traditional way of regarding early modern Ireland. It's the place that is lit up only by the fact that Spencer wrote the Faerie Queene there. But all around Spencer's Castle, in all directions, the plantation has assembled a remarkable cast list of English undertakers. And I want to start with them to indicate the range of cultural exchange going on. To the east and south are Raleigh's vast estates. Harriet and White are busily at work serving it in the interstices of their overseas adventures in Virginia. West of Kilcolman, Sir Thomas Norris is overseeing the construction of a castellated house in Mallow on the ruins of an old Desmond castle. And it is here that Sir George Carew will translate the Spanish epic of the conquest of Chile, Ercilla Zúñiga's La Huracana, and will be the assembly point for that vast amount of Gaelic manuscripts that he is energetically collecting and trying to expound for insight and intelligence into the natives. To the west, Around Castle Island lies the 13,000-acre seigneury of Sir William Herbert, the author of Croftus Sive de Hibernia Liber, and the man who converted the Dean of Art Furt, Nicholas Keenan, to the Reformed Church by arguing theology with him in Latin and lending him some of these titles. It's a fascinating thing of imagining that happening around Castle Island. But with the names of cultural actors among the incomers piling up, where are the Gaelic cultural actors? Andrew Trollope, who's an agent of Walsingham, writes to Walsingham, the great spymaster from Dublin, on the 12th of September in 1581. And he provides one answer to the questions. Who are the natives? What are they like? The Irish men, he says, except the walled towns, are not Christians, civil or humane creatures, but heathen, or rather savage and brute beasts. For many of them, as well women as men, go commonly all naked, saving only a loose mantle hanging about them. If any of them have a shirt and a pair of single-soled shoes, which they call brogues, they are all especially provided for. And the Earl of Clancar and Lord Morris came the 3rd of this instant to present themselves to my Lord Deputy at Dublin, being the chief city of all Ireland, in all their bravery. And the best robe or garment they wore was a russet Irish rug, worth about £1 apiece, and they had each of them a hat, a leather jerkin, a pair of hosen, which they called trows, and a pair of brogues, but not all worth a noble that either of them had. Mac Morris. Okay, so you can see where that name is coming from in part. Between them, the Fitzmaurices, Lords of Kerry, and James Fitzmaurice Fitzgerald, the Counter-Reformation brains behind the Desmond Rebellion, had gifted Shakespeare with a moniker for his intemperate stage Irishman in Henry V. That's Mac Morris in what I thought, even as I sat watching it in the Barbican in probably April of 2016, was the Brexit Henry V. Mac Morris was, 50 years of decolonialising or post-colonial scholarship had completely sailed past them. And he was an unreconstructed stage Irishman, but he did much better than Captain Jamie, who just made funny Scottish sounds and didn't actually say a word. He'd say things like that. You can see where the name comes from, in a way, with this conjunction of things. Mac Morris goes, in Heaney's words, gallivanting around the globe, saying things like, "By Christ, there is throats to be cut." He also crops up in just about every scholarly article on Renaissance Ireland. His blustering stage Irishisms scrutinised for revelations which, frankly, a walking, talking stereotype just cannot provide. In an attempt to shift the focus back onto actual Irish people, however, my Mac Morris project seizes upon his furious question, "What is my nation?" and assembles the cultural players across the spectrum to give their wildly different answers. We might see the project as an attempt to overlay the 1586 map, the one with all the names, to map that onto the plantation map of 1586. That is an attempt to syncopate Gaelic, Old English and New English sources to give us the fullest possible answer. So this evening I'd like to make a start by looking at one of those lords, those russet rugged lords scoffed at by Trollope. So he mentions the Lord Morris, and this is Thomas Fitzmaurice, and since I'm using him as a portal figure, as someone who can help us to cross the threshold between two linguistic and cultural worlds, it's only fitting that we should first meet him at a point of entry. Here is John Hooker's account in Holinshed's Chronicles of England, Scotland and Ireland, the 1587 edition, of Fitzmaurice storming Lisconnell Castle during the Second Desmond War in North Kerry. He went, Hooker tells us, Hooker, remember, is a lawyer and becomes Speaker of the Irish Parliament. He went to the castle of Lisconnell, in which were but 8 Englishmen, and the castle being very hard to be gained, he used this stratagem. He lay very close and tactfully a company of his men in an old house fast by the castle, and then he practised with an old woman, which was wont every morning to bring a great basket of coals or turf into the ward, that as soon as she was between the 2 gates of the castle, she should let fall her basket and cry out, which, when she did, one of the ward came and loosed the outer iron door, and then he did open the inner door. When she was come between the 2 doors, she let fall her great basket of coals and cried out. The company forthwith came, and the ward, not being able to draw unto them the outer iron door, nor to shut fast the inner door, the enemy entered, took the castle, killed all the ward, and cast them over the walls. There is much of interest here. There is that minatory bucket of coal or turf, which now reads like an ominous smoke signal from the epochal transition to CO2 emitting fossil fuels, which was actually just then getting underway. There is that rare sighting of a working class woman, here adding peril and goodness knows what economic or political calculus to her daily drudgery. Was she bribed to put herself in the jaws of danger? Was she forced? Or is she operating as a free political agent? We can't ever know. But my main focus this evening is on that threshold and the difficulty of negotiating a passage between the sealed worlds of Gael and Saxon. I'll begin by tracking Fitzmaurice through the English record. And what was interesting in all of these trackings that I've started doing is how 2 totally different individuals are described, irreconcilable and incommensurate. Thomas Fitzmaurice served with the Imperial Army in Milan before returning to Ireland to assume the title of 16th Lord Kerry and 11th Baron Lixnaw in 1550. Having delicately steered a path between his overlord, the Earl of Desmond, and the English forces encroaching upon him, he finally threw in his lot with the Earl during the Second Desmond War. He moved on from taking Lisconnell Castle to Ardfert. Here he came up with the second stratagem, built again around putting a woman, or built around a woman putting herself at extraordinary risk. And once again, we have John Hooker's account. Supposing, this is Fitzmaurice, supposing that hungry soldiers would be content to accept any courtesy, he procured a young harlot who was somewhat snout-fair to go to the castle, pretending some injury to have been done to her, and to humble herself to the captain's devotion, being supposed that he, by these means, would fall into the liking and fantasying of her, and so would retain her. And by these means, she, by her cunning handling of the matter, according unto the plot before contrived between Fitzmaurice and her, she should at one time or other find the occasion or opportunity to betray the castle. The captain received her into the castle, and not forgetting the late former practice at Lisconnell, caused him to be the more wary and circumstance, and to look unto himself. Whereupon he so handled the matter with this harlot that he, in the end, found out all the device, and forthwith he carried her up onto the top of the castle and cast her over the walls, where with a fall she was crushed and died. Hooker's telling is ribald and crudely, even triumphantly jocose, but it's possible to read another story between these lines. If we wondered about what impelled the old coal woman to put her life in danger, here we can again, I think, infer a sense of the woman's own agency. This is, after all, a plot, quote, contrived between Fitzmaurice and her. Left even more to inference, though, is the rough handling to which the young woman was subjected. The captain, Hooker tells us euphemistically, so handled the matter with this harlot that in the end she revealed the plot. Having seen how often euphemism covers the violence, including sexual violence, against women in these as in all wars, I dread to think what handling meant in practice. Both Trollope and Hooker's depictions of Fitzmaurice belong ostensibly to the realm of fact, of reportage and history writing. But their extravagant tellings reminds us that the crossovers which a project like this confronts are not just those between the Gaelic and the English worlds, they are also crossovers between fact and fiction, history and literature. And while we're following Thomas Fitzmaurice's sublation into English narrative, let's look at how Hooker's account of Fitzmaurice's misfired strategy at Ardfert is itself repurposed in The Faerie Queen. Edmund Spenser, as you know, was secretary to Lord Deputy Arthur Grey at the end of the Second Desmond War. He was with him at the massacre of Smerwick and was granted 3,000 of acres and Sir John of Desmond's castles, one of his many castles, Kilcolman Castle, in the plantation of Munster. In his great epic, the real-world violence of the Desmond War bleeds into his fiction. So in Book 5, he models the tyrant Polente on John of Desmond. And Polente's comeuppance, Polente, a Saracen, remember, which might explain the Saracen buildings we saw on the map earlier. Polente's comeuppance in the romance closely mirrors the real-life fate of Sir John of Desmond. Polente's head is chopped off and pitched upon a pole on high above the River Lee. That done, it's time for Artegall, the hero of Book 5, to go after Polente's daughter, Munera. Munera, for reasons to do with the allegory, which we needn't go into here, is imagined as having hands of gold and feet of silver. She is captured by Talus, the Tin Man destroyer deployed by Artegall so that he doesn't have to do the dirty work himself. This Artegall, in turn, is modelled on Spenser's benefactor, Lord Deputy Arthur Grey. And Spenser is very intent on keeping his hands clean against those charges of cruelty that had been levelled against him and caused his recall. Munera pleads for mercy, still holding up her suppliant hands on high and kneeling at his feet submissively, but he, her suppliant hands, those hands of gold, and eke her feet, those feet of silver try, which sought unrighteousness and justice sold, chopped off and nailed on high, that all might them behold. Then Talus drags the mutilated girl to the battlements, and her fall, when it comes, eerily replays that of Macmorris's unfortunate plant in Ardfert Castle. Herself then took he by the slender waist, in vain loud crying, and into the flood over the castle wall adown her cast, and there her drowned in the dirty mud. Not for nothing did Spenser speak of the Faerie Queen as, quote, a historical fiction. Thomas Fitzmaurice had sent his eldest son, Padraig, to London with Sir Henry Sidney in 1567, hoping to avail of surrender and regrant to escape his vassalage to Desmond. But Patrick returned home only to exchange court life in London for imprisonment successively in Cork, Limerick and Dublin Castle. Unsurprisingly, he joined the Desmond Rebellion as soon as he escaped. John Hooker is again on hand, this time to splutter his disbelief. Notwithstanding, he was trained up in the court of England, sworn servant unto her majesty, in good favour and countenance in the court, and apparelled according to his degree, and daily nurtured and brought up in all civility. He was no sooner come home, but away with his English attires, and on with his brogues, his shirt, and other Irish rags, being become as very a traitor as the veriest knave of them all. For like as Jupiter's cat transformed to never so fair a lady, and let her be never so well attired and accompanied with the best ladies, yet if a mouse come once in her sight, she will be a cat and show her kind. An ape, Hooker concluded, is but an ape, albeit he be clothed in purple and velvet. But we need to move on from where the English text leaves off and step metaphorically into Poricine Mac Murish's brogues, to go beyond accounts written out of hostility and incomprehension into the habitus of a North Kerry lord. It's interesting, the portraits of the lords with whom I'm concerned just do not exist, so you have to have these metonymic castles instead. A 49-quatrain eulogy addressed to him after his return from court, Donal Mac Dara Mac Brodacas, Ni Dúil Carda Craig Neville, it is wrong to delay a raid for captives, helps us to make that crossing. Mac Brodacca gives us privileged access to the Gaelicised world of the Old English aristocracy, and the highly Gaelicised Old English aristocracy, by bringing us inside Listowel Castle and its Muir Farshing or Hochig, its spacious hall with golden goblets, right in San Hort Hruigig Hjalver Klin, Ein Rove Enig on Irher, the fair, bright court, wide and full of steeds, old sanctuary of honour in the west. Mac Dara's playful conceit is that he and his fellow poets are so beholden to Mac Murish for his hospitality that they who have been held hostage by his generosity must now avenge the favour and take him hostage in return. Working metonymically, the poet conjures up the whole, the world to which Poricine Mac Murish returned from its parts, the wooing of fair maidens, the utterance of sages, cavalcades of horsemen, the flower of the grape, quaffed from pure gold, etc. And as he evokes excursions from the castle, Mac Brodacca powerfully conjures up the delight of being in that landscape, following the stag on cool slopes on fine days, riding out, swimming from the banks of the Feel, walking the strand, idly beachcombing the harvest of its fruitful tide. The poem quietens towards the end, and Mac Brodacca manages the shift in intensity by switching the focus from what Mac Murish will do to what he will see and hear, the Hifi, the Hlinfi. He lines up our field of vision with Poricine's, and as we see what he sees, hear what he hears, we access the allure of his world, the Hifi bark, a mule coin, the Hlinfi, the sound of the feel. And he ends with this extraordinary kind of downward beat, but it's not downbeat, it just settles into some kind of really ordinary normality. Lorabini, this is the river he's talking about, Lorabini, Moor an Tolverd Inthany. He shall see a bark in the harbour's mouth, he shall see a horse race, the river feel of gentle bright streams, he shall hear speaking. It will be a sweet strain, sufficient its melody, a great reason for gaiety. By aligning what the reader sees with what Poricine does, Mac Brodacca offers us the perspective of an insider. It doesn't just take over where the English texts leave off. It brings us somewhere more intimate and altogether different. The State Papers have much more to say about MacMorris in the years that follow. He's in Spain conspiring. He's back in Kerry, wounded in Dingle. Finally, on the 25th of August 1600, his principal castle in Lixsnow is seized by Sir Charles Wilmot. As George Carew reported with evident relish, I quote, "When he saw his chief house possessed by our forces, he took such an inward grief of the same as the 12th of this month he died, leaving behind him his son and heir as malicious a traitor as himself." Wilmot moved on to Listowel Castle, which he captured on the 2nd of December 1600. One of the most distinctive forms of bardic eulogy is what Catherine Sims calls the house poem. Operating within generic conventions superficially similar to English country house poems such as Ben Jonson's To Penshurst, they flatter the patron by praising his house. Quite often, the castle is addressed in the first person singular as though it were a sentient being. In such cases, there is an easy movement from addressing the castle as though it were alive to personifying it outright. The house poem often begins with the poet approaching and then entering the castle, staging a rite of passage that grants the reader, too, entry into the world of the Gaelic and Gaelicised elite. In the quarter of a century of conflict with which I'm concerned this evening, however, eulogies addressed to castles mutated into elegies addressed to ruins. Shortly after the capture of MacMorris's castle, Aengus Fionn O'Dolig, hereditary Olive to the MacCarthaigh Moor, wrote not a house poem, but a ruin poem addressed to Lixnaw Castle. That isn't Lixnaw Castle. Kerry County Council finally destroyed Lixnaw Castle in the 1960s when it mined it for road stones for the road. That's one of its outliers, that picture. But he writes this eulogy, Sorid Lath Alach Snow, farewell to you, Lixnaw. And in it, eulogy turns to despairing elegy. What was once a court, mirthful, royal, hospitable, is now a ruin, and the poem moves agitatedly back and forth between the incommensurate worlds on either side of what O'Dolig calls the urchra, the downfall. An hort shin de chlacht misha, minig furus intishi, reen manman mujna is machnish. I frequented that very court. Time and again I found in it the apex of understanding, exuberance and pleasure. O'Dolig still addresses Lixnaw Castle in the second person, a hort gial grim éidig, o fair, gloriously dressed court, a hort muirin, o mirthful court. But its ruination is too advanced for the personification to go very far. Its battlements are imagined as a head, but they are so shattered that it pains O'Dolig to look at them, and the deep dejection of her once bright countenance, her gnúis, leaves him lost for words. The poem breaks off at quatrain 22, a ruined poem contemplating a court, a society in ruins. We could do something very similar with the other russet-clad lord in Andrew Trollope's sneering description which set us off, Donal MacCarthaigh Moore, Earl of Clancarthy, who was himself an accomplished love poet, as well as being the patron and the subject of one of the most moving of all of the elegies of the time, Aengus Fionn O'Dolig's Sorid Led Chéile a Chashel, farewell to thy spouse, O Cashel, another poem addressed to a ruin. But I don't want to end with elegy to respond to the troubled origins of our modernity with, in Jacques Ranciere's words, nothing but the infinite work of grieving. Instead, I want to end with a poem that makes the journey from Munster, from Kerry, to Ulster, that I myself have made in coming here this evening. In a well-known passage from Spenser's A View of the Present State of Ireland, Irenaeus tells Eudoxus that he, quote, caused diverse poems to be translated unto me that I might understand them, unquote. And of course the fascination is finding how did that happen, and I think we're getting quite close to understanding some of those exchanges at least. But what he produces, what Spenser produces, is not a translation from any known or imaginable bardic poem, but instead a kind of parodic travesty. And he imagines a poet lavishing praise on a rebel in this fashion. One of their bards in his praise might say that he was none of those idle milksops that was brought up by the fireside, but that most of his days he spent in arms and valiant enterprises, that he never did eat his meat before he had won it with his sword, that he lay not slugging all night in a cabin under his mantle, but used commonly to keep others waking, to defend their lives, and did light his candle at the flame of their houses, to lead him in darkness, that the day was his night, and the night his day, that he loved not to lie wooing of wenches to yield to him, but where he came he took by force the spoil of other men's love, and left but lamentation to their lovers, that his music was not the harp nor lays of love, but the cries of people and clashing of armour, and that finally he died not wailing of many, but made many wail when he died that dearly bought his death. In exclusively Anglophone accounts of early modern Ireland, that is all we have. But as the MacMorris Project hopes to show, the excitement of the period is that there was never just one version of events. So I want to put Spenser's pseudo-bardic poem back to back with an actual bardic poem that shows just how alert Gaelic writers were to what the newcomers in their midst were saying about them. Cúchonnacht O'Dowley of Kilsarkin, County Kerry, was the last of the Earl of Desmond's hereditary olives. After the beheading of Earl Gerald and his brothers, Cúchonnacht found refuge in Ulster with Rú O'Donnell, accompanying him on campaign during the 9 Years' War. By 1598, however, Cúchonnacht was feeling the tug of his home place and took his poetic leaf of O'Donnell in a poem called Conas the Ágansha A. How could I leave Hugh? But O'Donnell has an uncanny awareness of how the English read him and his class, and their imagined words, the imagined words of the English, ring in his head. Quote, if I were to listen to the utterance of the foreigners, Don Neishtin Od Igla Gaul, he says, he would be terrified. But O'Donnell doesn't just listen, he ventriloquizes the English and their accusations. First, he imagines what they would say using the speech indicator adher thi, adher ish, they would say. I would be told. The English would say that. But then he turns away from reported speech, the adher ish, I would be told that a rue, the English would say I was honoured, etc. He turns away from that adher thi to direct speech, in which the English address him directly. So inside his poem, he is apostrophized by the English. Shiv Fain, they say to him, you yourself, like all of them, all of the poets, are pleased to praise their crimes. Inciting evil doing is part of your nature, the English voice says. It is as though O'Donnell allows Spenser's calumnies to take up residence in his own poem. And sure enough, so the whole poem is constructed about, I'll go back to Kerry, but every time I meet an English person, this is what they're going to say to me. So every quatrain is another accusation from another English voice. So, sure enough, just as Spenser imagines his pseudo-praise poet extolling the outlaw who did, I quote him again, did light his candle at the flame of their houses, here the ventriloquized English voice accuses O'Donnell of doing just that, of watching Hugh O'Donnell send Athenry up in smouldering, refulgent flames through a small Lunara Lasrach. But then, in a dazzling feat of poetic track-laying, O'Donnell builds up two more layers of quotation. First, the ventriloquized English voice quotes the poet's counsel to O'Donnell back at him. The scary English voice in O'Donnell's head addresses him in the second person, and in a quotation inside a quotation, he cites the poet's earlier incriminating pronouncements. So, you used to say to him, a bitter saying, your grievances against Croghan's host are great. So I've given two different quotation marks to indicate the blue one is the English voice saying you used to say, accusing him, and then he quotes what the English voice, the imagined English voice must imagine the Irish poet having said. The speech indicator adhertho is now being used by an English voice quoting O'Dowley. Then in an act of quiet subversion, O'Dowley adds yet another layer of speech. He interjects his own dissenting voice. While the ventriloquized English accuser piles on the charges, O'Dowley delivers his own sotto voce refutation in a series of parenthetical asides. You traversed Emona and Clan Hunvig along with him. It will rebound on you, the English accuser thunders. But O'Dowley begs to differ and spits out his under-the-breath refutation. A right worthy venture, he countercharges. O'Dowley's poem gives us much more than the other side of the story. Rather than providing merely the recto, as it were, to Spenser's verso view, the poem itself takes on and subverts the censure, which it then ventriloquizes. In stanzas 21 to 28, the ventriloquized Londoners are made to recapitulate, ostensibly as criticism, Éarú O'Donnell's major campaigns from 1595 to 97. But in reciting one after another the great sweep of his victories from Tara to Erris, from the Erne to Athenry as accusations, the ventriloquized voice is made to do something very paradoxical indeed. It is made to recite the battle roll, the cothraim, of its enemies' triumphs. It is ventriloquized into delivering a cothraim for the poet's patron O'Donnell. Spenser puts a parodic battle roll into the mouth of an imaginary bard, but the one-time bard of the Earl of Desmond here not only produced a ringing cothraim for the Earl of Tyrconnell, he ventriloquized the foreigners, the Fiann Gael, into singing it for him. By putting O'Dowley's ventriloquism of English voices back to back with Edmund Spenser's ventriloquism of a bard, we see the polyphony of the cultural energies of early modern Ireland disrupting and interrupting each other in very complex ways. Something quite remarkable is happening in this period. Before Kinsale, before the flight of the Earls, before the Urchá, as Angus Fionn calls it, before everything changes, everything is still in play. Two formidable and formidably distinct cultures operate side by side in all their particularity and at the same time in their differently oriented openness to continental influences. England may have been on the cusp of imperial greatness, but the rich hybrid culture of Gaelic and Gaelicized Ireland had no reason whatsoever to imagine that it was living in the shadow of its impending eclipse. So, as we plunge into the immense and plural archive of early modern Ireland, we need to find a way of capturing that complexity, to give equal weight to two cultures coexisting in tense equipoise, each as vibrant, each as convinced of its future as the other. Thank you.